Hi, it's Mark Owen from Moose Marketing and PR, the editor of Punchline magazine, and welcome to Punchline Talks. Today I'm joined by Jeremy Drew. He's the Developments Director at Newland Homes. Hi, Jeremy. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Mark. No, thank you for having me.
Now, Newland Homes seem to be everywhere at the moment. Can you tell us a bit more about the company, please?
Okay. So Newland Homes, we're obviously a housing developer. We're privately owned. We were founded in 1991 during a recession. At the time, it was referred to as the recession, but obviously they happen periodically. But we now operate from Barnwood Business Park. We have around 74 staff, and that's both in-house at the offices here, but also on site offices and site sales. So we develop across the Southwest. We tend to look at a range of about an hour and a half's drive from head office as being sensible. And we've currently got 10 sites that are in build and or sales, totaling around 420, 430 houses. Operating area up to Tewkesbury, Evesham, across to Cricklade, Swindon, into sort of east of Wiltshire, south into Frome, Trowbridge, Devizes, so Mendip district, and then across to North Somerset, Claverham, Yatton, that sort of airport route out of Bristol, and obviously the gaps in between Cheltenham, Gloucester, Stroud and Cotswolds. Probably just to wrap up on that tiny bit, in those 31 years since inception, we've completed approaching 4,000 houses, and almost all of them new build, a very few refurbs that we've acquired together with sites. And during that time, are proud to have evolved and justified a reputation for quality and design.
Now, the housing industry has changed enormously, and at this particular moment, it must be quite difficult to cost up. We all know the prices are going up of everything, bricks, wood, labour. How the hell do you work out, the sites, and how do you make it work financially, building a house nowadays?
Well, by being well organised and by having imaginative, creative approaches to site design, by factoring in those costs as accurately as you can, by, I suppose, the experience we've built up of knowing what constitutes a development, so that there are fewer and fewer unexpecteds, and we continue to manage to make it work, to acquire new sites, and to make good margins. So it's doable. But whilst you look externally like a creative delivering company, like a swan, I suppose, out back of that, there's a great deal of work that goes on.
So how do you choose the actual sites itself? Do you think, right, okay, we get into the sort of strategic plan of the council, or how does a house builder go around developing an actual site?
Well, we've evolved into a company with a number of discrete departments. They're all key. One of those key departments is the land department, who ensures it is extremely well connected so that off-market opportunities come to it. we also ensure that any piece of land that's available on the market, we're aware of it. We also, and which is probably a helpful distinguishing factor as far as Newland Homes, is we're always looking for an opportunity. That could sound a little cynical. It's not. It's a, always looking for that win-win. And we have an approach that is probably the opposite of being fixed in our view as to what we want. We're pragmatic, we're alive to opportunities, plus also we have amongst these various departments highly skilled and competent design and technical and engineering and surveying departments, all of which can evaluate and understand those sites very thoroughly, very accurately, and use the relationships we've got with local authorities too, to ensure that we're not flying a kite unnecessarily.
Now, Newland Homes are well respected and well known. I was actually talking to some councillors in Cheltenham, and they were kind of waxing lyrical about your green credentials.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more about that, please, and
Yeah,
why it's so important?
Well, of course I can. I mean, the site that they're talking about in Cheltenham would be one at Kidnappers Lane, just off south of Sherdington Road. And we recently gained consent for that site. So I think that's 22 houses, some quite valuable detached houses and some affordable housing. But a few years ago, not that many, if I went perhaps to the background of why it is and what we do, if you'd like, Mark. In 2019, climate awareness has not really been as aware as it probably should have been on reflection. And it, for me, albeit, people talked about it, but that until I sat down, funnily enough, it was with my housebound mum towards the end of her life. And, our discussions involved, going and sitting in front of the telly. And we watched David Attenborough's Climate Change, The Facts. So that was in 2019, May, I think, that sort of time. Well, it was quite a hollowing out sort of a watch, at the end of which we kind of looked at one another and said, we've got to be doing something, which on looking back now, it seems bizarre that, that one should be so possibly ill-informed as to the real issues. But I doubt I was unique in that. And one of the particular things about what the climate change agenda or whatever advocates are saying is that obviously fossil fuels are really bad news because they create carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas and contributes to global warming, and being able to understand that and then putting that in the context of the government's strong desire for the industry to be building 300,000 homes a year, and computing that probably means that the absolute vast majority of those are going to be powered by gas boilers. And that's just one aspect of their sort of carbon generation, I suppose. So in a very simple way, I came away from that and popped back into work and said, surely everybody's seen this program. We need to ditch the gas boiler. Obviously, we're not a massive PLC battleship that takes blooming 3 circumnavigations of the Earth to be able to change direction. But we are nevertheless, 80 odd million pound turnover machine that can't turn around at the drop of a hat. So it wasn't a universally understood or welcomed concept, the notion that we should change, but by working through that, we've evolved a situation where we can. But what was key in that transition was that as we understood what could be achieved by the use of these air source heat pumps, which the media's talked a lot about, so I won't bore you with that necessarily, but essentially an efficient electricity-based system to provide heating and hot water to the home, coupled with a good level of fabric insulation and the use of solar power to obviously win renewable electricity. We asked the question as to how close that combination could get to providing a zero carbon home. And in that journey or adventure, we had to, in fact, understand what is the definition of a zero carbon home. And, thankfully, there is a definition that essentially says, where the home's prime energy, and that is its heating, direct wired lighting, and hot water, can be supplied effectively by itself. Can be being the operative word, because obviously solar panels don't necessarily operate 24 hours a day, and they might operate most effectively in one part of the day when a householder is not necessarily using that energy. But anyway, when we asked the question, were quite surprised to learn and gratified that it was possible to generate a net zero carbon home using the technology that was available at our fingertips. That's not to say it wasn't going to cost a significant investment to be able to do that and to provide that. But in the circumstance where climate awareness was increasing, and talking to all of the other departments at the company here, we felt that despite the cost and the organizational changes that would be needed to implement this, it was something that, for in fact the first site that we'd identified, which was a relatively premium site, would be worthwhile exploring and offering to the market. In fact, we started to think that it would be possible to get a green premium, so that customers would pay extra for this facility, particularly on a more discretionary purchase like a more premium detached house. And so we sought to apply it. In fact, that was to a site in Tickenham. So that is near Nailsea. Nailsea, the suburb of Bristol, in North Somerset. So we applied that, and in fact, just this last weekend, we completed on the sale of our first 2 houses of net zero carbon houses. But that's jumping forwards a little bit. We then had a couple of other sites, and our Cheltenham site was one of them. We're coming through the planning process, and that we felt, you know what, that net zero carbon approach could be equally applicable. Now, whether the events like the global heating events that we've witnessed and the global heating or fuel issues that we're now experiencing, they've kind of appeared to make the decision that we took on those sites look more logical, possibly even prescient. But I think it was the right choice. But that what was possibly sticking our necks out was that essentially from 2022 onwards, we're now a net zero carbon developer. I suppose you never say never, i.e. there might be a site that simply doesn't work and we nevertheless want to develop it, but have to look at an alternative way of doing it. But, you know, everything that is now arriving on site, everything that was going through planning is net zero carbon. You mentioned the costs and how you manage it. I suppose it's all going to wash through and we'll understand it better. But COVID has made a bit of a mockery of the pundits who thought that the whole industry was going to fall in a heap, and has seemed to provide a strong impetus to the market, whilst at the same time the much talked about planning.
I mean, COVID didn't really close down the market. Let's be honest. The construction industry never stopped. They carried on working all the way through COVID.
You're absolutely right. Well, we and many others stopped for a very brief period of time. And it was, looking back, it was almost like a taking stock stop. And it was a, let's kind of figure out just how we're going to manage this. But, you know, I suppose in fairness to government at the time, there was a clear guidance that the development industry needs to carry on. And, you know, clearly the last thing we wanted to do was to not carry on. But the concern was, if we carry on and build it, is everybody going to be, you know, quivering in a corner saying, my goodness, what's all this about? What am I going to do? But it quickly became apparent that far from the market disappearing, it opened up a new market for people who wanted to work from home and or have more space, and or were just, you know, reevaluating their lifestyle and needs. And we're still, as an industry, I think, enjoying that strength of demand, albeit it's, you know, possibly slowing at the moment.
I mean, it might be slowing at the moment because the cost of living crisis, or as people's jobs aren't as safe as they used to, because we're moving into the sort of third quarters that's going to get a little bit tight. Have you had to fundamentally change the way these houses are built then, really? Because it sounds like to me you have a house. All you've done now is, not all you've done, I don't mean it, but you put a heat pump in it, you put some solar panels on it, you put an EV at the front, and voila, you're sort of net zero. I mean, do you have little turbines at the top as well? Is that too annoying?
No, we were in the process of upgrading our build fabric in any event because of emerging regulations changes. And I think we took an early decision to have that enhanced construction in order to, and that helped the overall calculation. But fundamentally, and I think this is what the industry and the received wisdom has always been, that a zero carbon home is some one-off special, I mean, you know, architect designed, or for a self-builder who, you know, as possibly just wants to invest and doesn't want or need to make money. What we demonstrated is that actually it's possible to make a regular Newland's version of a developer's house, because I don't necessarily see us as, you know, the mainstream PLC Inc. developer, but nevertheless, you know, we do have house styles that we repeat, so it's not like everything's a one-off. But we determined that net zero carbon can be applied to those houses without turning the whole thing upside down and reinventing it. And I don't think people had necessarily understood it, that that was possible. And even if they did understand it, what's in it for the vast majority of developers to publicize that fact to their customers if, in consequence, their customers are either going to say, well, I'm not going to buy from you because you got gas boilers and your EPC rating B or C, and they're not going to want en masse to be spending an extra 10K or whatever on the build of their houses. So it's one of those, it also emerges, I think, that it's one of those secrets that more people know than you might imagine, but it's just not in their interest to be acting upon it. You know, you get a number of the major house builders publicizing the fact that they've got an experimental house here that they're going to research for a year. And it's just kicking the can down the road. What we're doing is, and I know that we get some feedback from other developers who are saying, you know, we think what you guys are doing is incredible, but it's not that incredible. And in fact, what it's certainly from what we can see, our site at Tickenham, for example, we've done a little bit of research looking at the comparable cost of comparable products in the local area. And we feel we've justified a premium on our sales prices. So, you know, arguably, all we've done is made a commercially astute decision. But and the longer we're the absolute minority doing it, the almost like the greater our success, albeit in reality, you'd like to see more people doing it.
I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? If it sounds like to me that, you know, why can't the other big boys do it? That, you know, you've got all these thousands and thousands of houses that are being made, and we see them all around Gloucestershire. We all know who the other manufacturers are, or construction companies are, house builders. Why aren't they all doing the same?
Well,
you know, I mean, surely it's not that difficult.
No, I think it's cost. I think it's inertia. I think that, you know, don't get me wrong, there are other associated issues that make it supremely blooming difficult to organize. You know, when you go from having a site that's got electricity and gas going into it to just electricity, then all of that power, even though your heat pumps are very efficient, has to be provided out of the grid, and the grid operating companies have to assume that your solar panels are not producing anything, because there obviously will be times when they won't be. So the electricity infrastructure supply becomes a very complex thing to manage, and we've had to employ specialists to undertake calculations to have those discussions with the grid supplier to ensure that they just don't say, well, you can't have this development for another 10 years until the grid's all been reinforced in the local area. And so we've been able to have to manage that, and, you know, current limiting devices or things of that nature, limiting the number of possible enhancements to substations in the local area, because clearly, you know, sometimes those costs have to be borne, and maybe that is an associated impact, that there's an extra cost for doing that. So there's that. There's another issue that we're now finding, and it's sort of associated with the you know, microchip shortage. Everything's kind of powered by microchip. and the lack of availability of some of the components. We ensured that we selected some providers for our heat pumps and our solar panels and our inverters, which are the main components of the of that, and indeed our batteries. I'll mention our batteries in a moment. And we secured some supply agreements with those people. That still means we're sort of struggling a bit, but you know, in business, it's about giving that commitment to suppliers and expecting that they will reciprocate and ensure that, you know, when Barratt's suddenly decide, and no disrespect to Barratt's, you know, that they're going to change everything to air source heat pumps and they wade into the argument and say, I want them all, that we've still got suppliers who value the relationship with us.
Yes. And talking about your batteries,
yes,
obviously that must be one of the fundamental and most important thing of all, because the whole idea is you need to store the energy that's been created or taken from the heat pumps or from the solar, and then to use later on.
No, you're absolutely right. But you know, and power management is where clearly where it's at, and the efficient use of power going right the way through all the, you know, electrical components within the house and the electrical drains on the power. But the battery, you're right, is fundamental. Ironically, the battery itself and the provision of a battery doesn't make a difference to the house achieving a net zero carbon certification. But because what your net zero carbon says is that you if you're generating the electricity that would power those prime energy sources in the house, then you're net zero carbon. But if in reality that energy you're creating is going back into the grid, you will get a small payment from the energy provider called, I think it's Smart Export Guarantee, but it won't be the equivalent of what you'd have to pay for the electricity. So the smart people, and we're offering as an extra, because as I say, it doesn't in itself contribute to the net zero carbon of the house, but it contributes to the efficiency of the running cost. So we're making available to customers a battery as part of that process. And I can't properly bring to mind the stats, but I think with a battery, you can expect to utilize in excess of 50% of all of the power that you generate from your solar. But of course, if you have a battery, the other thing you can do if you're on a variable tariff is that once you've discharged your battery, say in the evening when everybody's at home and watching telly and having baths and you know, using the kettle, then during the night that battery can recharge from the grid and at cheaper rate than during the day. Then when the household gets up in the morning and, you know, again, it's toasters and ovens and lights and blooming phone chargers, then the battery will contribute towards that power use. And then when people head off out to work or when the usage is lower during the day, obviously daylight and powering the solar panels. So it's quite a good model and quite an intuitive model. So I believe we've had a certain amount of take up for the batteries, and it's of course possible to retrofit them as well. So ultimately, you know, when a customer wants, if they ultimately decide initially not to have one, but then to get one, they can. And also you can stack them. You can, you know, have one battery and then stick another one on top of it too. So those things are possible too. So yeah, the future I think is about power management, and that's, you know, never more real now when the fuel costs are what they are.
So let's just very quickly talk about yourself, Jeremy. Are you from
Okay.
Gloucestershire?
Well, as it happens, I'm from Swindon.
We won't hold that against you.
Yeah. Well, Bristol originally, but Swindon from a very young age. Yes.
And how did you arrive at Newland Homes?
Well, okay.
Bear in mind, we're coming to the end of the.
Well, I went to a Swindon comp. I went to. After that, I worked as a builder's labourer. My father was an architect, funnily enough, in Swindon, quite well known as had his practice. I worked for him during the summer holiday. Then when I figured I had to actually make an honest living, I joined the council's, Swindon Borough Council's architects department, and did a technical day release course. And then after, I think towards the end of that 2-year course, I joined a local developer, Bradley Homes, now no longer, but well known at the time, and found that they let you design things, which was great. Worked for a couple of other housing developers to hone that skill. And then probably in the early 90s, I was freelancing as a design consultant and found myself working exclusively for Newland Homes that had started, you know, a year, 2 years prior to that. And of course, you know, my free business course that was available as a government initiative at the time said, don't put all your eggs in one basket. So I took the calculated decision and suggested they might like to employ me as their design manager. But, you know, I did the technical drawings and coordinated the engineering as well. So effectively, you know, my drawing board I've carried with me through my career, but joined Newland Homes. It's been party to and part of the expansion of that company over the years. I joined the board in 1999. Funnily enough, I mean, when I first started working for Newland Homes, like the two founders of Newland Homes, we all worked from our respective homes. I had a die-line print machine in my garage, and you know, it's kind of what you did, but we got offices in Cheltenham and then ultimately in Barnwood, and the teams have you know, been populated and been built in the meantime. And you know, now my job as sort of having some vision and coordination of our developments and projects, I couldn't say that, you know, I have the vision or anything like that, because it's collectively shared and implemented by the team of you know, motivated, skilled colleagues around, and it's you know, it's a joy.
Okay, Jeremy. So if I went to your car, then what sort of CD? What's the latest CD that you've got in your car, or download that you've just? I can't imagine you having to download. No offense, because we talked about social media earlier.
Yeah.
And, so what's the latest music that you've listened to?
The latest music is probably something that's 100 years old. I spent the last 20 years and still learning the piano, and I listen to piano pieces that I happen to be learning. So I'm afraid it's very boring. It's not up to the minute. But right now you'd probably find the Minuet of the Sweet Bergamask by Debussy.
Okay. That's not boring at all. That's not boring at all, sir. My best friend's learning to play the piano actually, and he's doing extremely well. Every time I see him, He seems to have done another grade. I've got to ask you, actually, behind you, that it looks like you've got some handcuffs hanging from it.
Yeah. Well, it's, to stop me falling asleep or falling off the drawing board at 8 o'clock in the evening. No, I just, it's an essential part of any draftsman's armory, and that's a roll of drafting tape.
Right, okay.
It looks like a big polo, but no, it's a roll of drafting tape. And as a Luddite, I still stick my stuff on the drawing board and think with my hand, albeit that's not to say that I'm the only person who does that at Newland Homes, far from it, but the other guys are doing it in a much more efficient computer-based way than I am.
Now I've got to ask you, I ask all my guests who come on to Punchline Talks, the big interview, what's your top 3 business tips, please, Jeremy?
Right, wow. I kind of tend to think that, every person associated with business is on their own journey. So they've got to find their way rather than necessarily being told what to do. And maybe, one might argue that that's a business tip, in as much as don't blooming do it just because somebody else says so.
Okay. That's number one. You have to find your own way and don't do something just because somebody else is.
Yeah. I've had both planning officers and land agents say, we like working with Newland Homes because you do what you say you're going to do. And of course, together with my colleagues here, of course, you think to yourselves, well, does that mean that some people clearly don't do what they say they're going to do? Why would that be the case? But it's definitely stood us in good stead and sort of encouraged repeat business. And obviously it's very nice to have the reputation for doing what you say you're going to do, and for people to come to you for that reason, because the last thing they want is to be messed around.
Okay, do what you say you're going to do. And the third and final one.
And well, finally, and it's probably only a relatively recent realization, is it's all about the teams that you generate, or that that get created in a company. You may think you're a big cheese in an organization, but to sit in a meeting room or a boardroom and to be surrounded by people whose views and opinions are probably equally as important as yours, and that you respect very much, and that there's no edge, no animosity, because everybody's on the same, to use a horrible business expression, page, is, I think, the secret to being able to sustainably expand an organization. It's just so not about the ego, it's about the team.
Jeremy, thanks ever so much for joining Punchline Talks. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you very much.
All the very best for your time. Cheerio.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.